September 10th, 1978, I was baptized in Los Angeles, California, in a guy's backyard in his pool. And we went out to lunch, and we were talking, and I was a new Christian, and I said, I just don't know. You know the Bible so well. I don't know I'm ever going to have a grasp of it. And he said, let me tell you something. Read something in or about the Bible every single day, and every day read a proverb. The Proverbs is God's wisdom given to us. It's not very valuable theologically, but it is invaluable practically. It shows us how to live, shows us how to operate as parents, as children, as husbands, as wives. And so I'm going to give you the challenge to read a proverb every single day. I've been doing it for 47 years now. And every single day something pops up at me. I'm like, I've been reading this 47 years. I can't believe I never saw this before. And so today, on the third, there's a great passage in Proverbs chapter 3. It says, trust in the Lord with all of your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Which is really relevant to the passage that we're going to talk about today in Colossians. Because here's the thing. Yesterday I was clever and I wanted to change the world. But today I'm wise and I realize I need to change myself. And that is the message today in Colossians. I've learned that I've leaned on my own understanding for so long, and that's worked out great. But I've learned to lean on God's understanding. I've tried to be clever and manipulate my circumstances, but God's wisdom always comes back. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Today we're going to look at some radical guidelines that Paul gives us. They were radical in his day. They are anti-cultural in today's day. Still, they're radical. It takes a lot to do what Paul is talking about to please the Lord. He keeps saying, to please the Lord. They're radical because they run contrary to our wills and our society, as they did in Paul's day. So if you'll turn with me to Colossians chapter 3. We'll be looking at verses 18 through chapter 4, verse 1. And it's the kingdom script for the family and for leadership. So, ladies, let me ask you a few questions. What if you were married to a man who rendered you beautiful through the sacrifices he made for you? What if you were married to a man who secured justice in the home, established order, and provided structure, and always leading the family deeper into the kingdom of God? And always helping others in the family thrive. What if you were married to a man who shielded you from the harms and real and perceived in the world, or defended your honor when you weren't there? What if you were married to a man who protected your family physically, emotionally, and financially? What if you were married to a man who understood how life works and shared that wisdom? Mentored the family in spiritual, intellectual, and recreational means? What if you were married to a man who constantly pursued self-improvement and worked to improve you, to bring out the best in you? What if you were married to a man who was connected so deeply with you that you always felt safe, never led you into danger, so you always felt secure, and worked to always bring out the best in you so that you always felt loved? If you were married to that man, you'd be married to me. No, I'm telling you. My wife will tell you. If you were married to that man, you'd be married to a man who loves you as Christ loved the church and gave his life for it. That'd be a man who lived in such a way that, as the passage says today, is fitting to the Lord. Now I got a question for you men. Are you that man? Do you even want to be that man? I could say, well, I'm not that man. I'm not interested in being that guy. Do you want to be that guy? Wives, look at your husbands now and see if they're saying yes or just saying, who invited this guy? The ancient Stoics promoted a structure to the household, reasoning that it is fitting according to nature. It is fitting to live this way according to nature. But when a Christian convert was instructed on the nature of the family, they were told that it is fitting to the Lord. It's not what society agrees with. It's not what nature supports. It's what's fitting to the Lord, and that's how we want to live. Paul presents this new order of domestic code divided into three related parts: wives and husbands, children and parents, slaves and masters. We could say employers and employees. All seems like a Father Knows Best guideline, doesn't it? Anybody remember the Father Knows Best? That show, Father Knows Best? Yeah, here's some people. My people. Remember Father Knows Best? It was a show that ran in the 50s and the 60s, and it was Robert Young was the dad, Jim Anderson, honey, I'm home, and the kids were great, and the wife was beautiful, and the house was made, and dinner was there. Robert Young, years later in an interview, said he hated doing that show because it was a lie. Because his life, it was a script, but his life, he was an out-of-control alcoholic who was suicidal and constantly tried to commit suicide. He said he hated presenting that lie every single day. But Paul presents us with the truth. Why? Because it's fitting to the Lord. Taking a look at Colossians 3:18 and 19, Paul says, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. The ancient Greek word that Paul's using for submit is essentially borrowed from a military term, and it means to be under in rank. I listen to the people who are in charge of me, not because they're better, not because they're smarter, not because they're better looking, but because they're in charge of me, and because that's what is fitting. The idea of submission doesn't have anything to do with someone being smarter or being better. It's just their position. And in this place, it's the God-given position. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary on the book of Colossians, he says, anyone who has served in the armed services. Do you have any people in the armed forces who's ever served in the armed forces? Sir, the Navy? You serve in the... I hope so. You're wearing a Navy hat. Did you ever have an option to say to your commanding officer, you know what, I'm not good with that. I don't think I'm going to do that. No, you didn't. It has to do with order and authority, not value and ability. What does a biblically submissive wife look like? A biblically submissive wife is not passive or inferior, but a spiritually strong woman who voluntarily yields to her husband's God-given role of leadership in the family, while maintaining her own dignity, her own voice, her own spiritual maturity. How's that done? How's that possible? How do I become, well, I can't become a submitting wife, but you ask yourself, how do I become a submitting wife? It's done actively aligning to the will of God's design. It starts with submission to Christ for all of us. Understand what biblical submission is and isn't. Ask God to cultivate a gentle and quiet spirit in you. 1 Peter 3:4, it says, advises women to cultivate an inner beauty of gentle and quiet spirit. The inner beauty described as imperishable means it's highly valued by God. Guard yourself against false submission. Wisdom and Proverbs. If you read the wisdom in Proverbs, you'll be intentional. Let me explain what biblical submission is and it's not. What it is a voluntary respect for a husband's leadership. What it is not is blind obedience or silence. You're there to be a helpmeet, not a doormat. It's a spiritual posture of humility. It's not inferiority or loss of identity. You're not less than. It's a trust in God's design. It's not weakness or codependency. It's supportive, but not voiceless. And what it's not is agreeing with everything uncritically. My wife does not agree with everything I say. She should. But she doesn't. And for the things that we disagree on, I'm so thankful for that. Because I'd have made mistakes that I probably wouldn't outlive. What submission doesn't mean is tolerating abuse or ungodly behavior. In the care team, we always advise women, if it's an abusive situation, remove yourself and your children from the harm. Get out of that abusive situation. It doesn't mean suppressing your gifts or calling or personality. You are a masterpiece created by God. God doesn't want you to lose that. He wants you to live in that and express that. In fact, he wants to magnify that in the role that you play as a wife. It doesn't mean losing your voice or your identity. Like I said, my wife's voice is an invaluable piece in my life. It doesn't mean following a husband into sin or moral compromise. Let me tell you something. In the past 3 years as working as the pastor of the care team, I see some sad stories of people leading their family into sin and immoral situations. It doesn't mean that. That's not submission. In submission, wives mirror the nature of Christ because he submitted to the Father. He washed his disciples' feet. He obeyed to the point of death. That's what submission looks like. And on the other side of the coin, Paul says, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. In the ancient world, all the power and all of the privileges belonged to the husbands because the woman was a possession. It wasn't a relationship, it was a possession. The powers and the privileges belonged to the husbands. So what Paul is saying is really countercultural. William Barclay, in his commentary on Colossians, says, under Jewish law, a woman was a thing. She was a possession of her husband, just as much as his house, or his flocks, or his material goods. She had no legal right, whatever. But the Lord is calling us husbands to something higher than the world's standards. Here's how that works, and here's how it looks like in God's kingdom. He leads by serving, not controlling. He protects her spiritually, emotionally, and physically. And he prioritizes her needs even when it costs him. A woman once asked me, hey, how should I be expected to be treated by a guy? That's a good question. How should you expect to be treated by a man? Anybody here ever been to the Louvre? Okay, oh, that's great. I've never been to the Louvre, but the Louvre houses history's greatest masterpieces by history's greatest artists. But there's a code of conduct in the Louvre. You respect the art. It's not the jump and jive club, right? You're not jumping around with your friends. You respect the art. You respect where you are in the presence of some of the greatest artists, genius in the world. You maintain a calm atmosphere. You move carefully and courteously. You respect the barriers and boundaries. So you don't get to walk into the Louvre like me and my friends would as teenagers and just act like jerks. There's a standard. You're walking amongst history's masterpieces of some of the greatest minds. And what I told her is, you are more holy than the Louvre. Be careful who walks into your life and touches your soul. Your spirit is the dwelling place of God. Nobody gets to wander in carelessly, not respecting the wonder and the beauty of who you are. We are fearlessly and wonderfully made, not respecting your boundaries. That's how you should expect to be treated. And men, that's how we should treat our wives, as a masterpiece. Paul says, husbands, love your wives. Do not be harsh with them. Frederick Buechner wrote, a marriage made in heaven is one where a man and a woman become more richly themselves together than the chances of either of them ever manage to become alone. I could not be where I am right now if it really wasn't for my wife. And it's interesting because my wife stands behind me and goes, go, go, go. But she stands in front of me and says, no, no, don't say that. Don't do that. Don't write that. Paul Washer describes marriage as two broken, sinful people living in close proximity. How's that going to work? That ain't going to work out. And then add children. Now it's even more complicated. And then add in-laws. And then he says to the children, obey your parents in everything. For this, not because your parents deserve it, not because your parents aren't lame, not because your parents aren't wrong, but because it pleases the Lord. The word that Paul uses to obey is hupakou. It means to portray a disposition to yield to another. And Paul says, obey in all things. He's proclaiming that children are not the judges of what they should or should not obey. Right? I know so many times my dad would say something, I'm not doing that. See, when I was growing up, my dad would create chores for us on Saturday mornings. On the Saturday mornings, he was home. He was a New York City fireman, so he wasn't home every Saturday. Thank goodness for that. But he wouldn't forewarn us. He would just spring it on us when we woke up that Saturday morning. For example, we had hedges all around our house, and we had these big hedges, and he would have us clip them. But he didn't believe in power tools. All had to be done with big clippers and little clippers for finer detail. I'm not a landscaper. And I'd wake up early in the morning, I'd look out my window, and I'd see those clippers laid out by the hedges, and I knew what was coming. So I'd slip out the back door, and I'd leave. Now, my brother Andy, he always worked, so he wouldn't be available on Saturday. So it was my older brother Charlie who was left to clip the hedges. And it wasn't just that it was you were clipping hedges. I mean, that's not fun. But my father would stand behind you. No, you're doing that wrong. No, you're doing that wrong. Well, you just do it yourself then. I knew that when I got home, I was going to get it. But it was better than all day. I'm sorry for Charlie, but hey, you should have seen it and taken off with me. But the fact is, seriously, I was a little wise guy. And not only did I disobey my father, I disrespected him. And that produced resentment in his heart from me that went all the way to the week before he died. It was a progression in my life. All things, Paul says, all things, even clipping hedges, all things, because this pleases the Lord. Don't overlook the proposition 4, because that's why you do it. Not because it's right, not because it's fun, but because it pleases the Lord. We're called to obey our parents, not because they're perfect, but because God tells us to. And our obedience pleases him. So what do you think our disobedience does? Displeases him. If you love me, Jesus said, you'll keep my commandments. When children obey, the Lord is pleased. Next, he has advice for the fathers. This is interesting. Fathers, do not embitter or exasperate your children, or they will become discouraged. When I was raising my children, I have 6 kids. We now have 6 grandchildren, 2 more to come. We'll have 8 grandchildren. And I needed some advice. So I asked my friend, I said, hey, man, you have any advice on biblically how to raise kids? He said, sure, don't exasperate your children. I was like, really? That's all you got? See, my children seem to be overly exasperated. Anybody here raising teenagers? Anybody raise teenagers or raising teenagers? Raise your hands. Okay, look at these people. Look around. Look at these people. They're exhausted. We're done. We have been wiped out. Everything, we just white flags. Okay, whatever you want to do. If you're thinking of raising children, look at these people. They're tired. They're wiped out. Their children have exasperated them. We haven't exasperated them, children. But John MacArthur, in his commentary, he talks about what it means to exasperate children. And he has 10 things that exasperate children. Number one, by neglect. David wasn't a good dad. He wasn't. He was indifferent to Absalom. His one child raped his daughter, and then the other child killed him. And his children rebelled against him because he neglected to stand in where he's supposed to stand in. By overprotection. My son Jamie is a third-degree black belt in karate. When he was in high school, he was just a black belt. And when he was a freshman, he used to get picked on all the time by seniors. They'd push him, knock his books down. I guess that's what seniors did. We never did that in my day. But they would pick on him all the time. And so he came home to me and he said, Dad, I don't know what to do. These seniors, they're picking on me. And they push my books down, and they're always giving me a hard time in the cafeteria. And I said, well, you're a freshman, what do you want me to do? And you want me to go talk to the principal? No, you can't do that. I don't want you to do that. I need some advice. I said, Jay, you're a black belt in karate. The next time they push you, go into your fighting stance. Now, you may not, I can't beat them up. Maybe you can't beat them up, but you can hurt them. You can make them regret. So the next week, he goes into school, and they push him into his locker, and he goes, all right, let's go. And they're like, dude, calm down. He says, nope, I'm not calming down. This is the last day. This doesn't happen anymore. This is the last day. We're going to settle it. And they all backed off. Figuring, this guy's too crazy to mess with. But when my other sons went to high school, it's crazy Sikoryak. Don't mess with them. I could have maybe stopped it and gotten those guys in trouble. Probably would have been worse for him. But he protected himself. By showing favoritism, we exasperate our children. By depreciating their worth. By not encouraging them. There's one thing, I run a ministry called This One Voice. It's for people who come from addicted or dysfunctional families. And there's 3 things that we do. One of the first things is we have people say that they're proud of themselves because they never heard it. That's important. My first day at college, 1974. Now, this is the impact that parents have on their children. My first day at college, 1974, I'm leaving the house, and my father says, listen, don't screw this up. I was like, oh, okay. If you were going for encouragement, Dad, you never really quite got there. But my mother said, Terence, this is where you get to show who you are. Man, I listened to her. And my first day back, and my first day out of class, I'm walking through the parking lot to my car, and I realize the old Terence ain't going to make it here. This is really where I get to show who I am. Don't depreciate their worth. By setting unrealistic goals. My father said, he always wanted me to be a dermatologist. I don't know why. And I don't like my pimples. I don't want to look at other people's pimples for the rest of my life. And a week before he died, he said, I always wanted you to be a dermatologist. Yeah, no, Dad, you know what? Why? They make good money and they're never on call. Oh, okay. Don't set unrealistic goals for your children. By failing to show affection, either verbally or physically. I tell my kids all the time I love them. Even now, they're grown-ups and they have kids of their own. And I hug them and I kiss them and I put God's name on them and I tell them I love them. And even when they were little, I realized I'm giving them something I really never got. What a special thing that God has blessed me to show affection and love to my children. They don't know what it's like not to get it. By not providing for their legitimate needs, by a lack of standards. This is what we stand for, this is what we won't stand for in this house. by destructive criticism or by excessive discipline. Never discipline in anger. I know when I read that, never discipline in anger. When do I discipline? It's the only time I discipline is when I'm in anger. I learned, there were times I went overboard with my kids, and I had to go and make amends to them. And I met with all of them, and I said, look, I just want you to know, there were times when I said things that were too quick and they hurt you. There were times when I was out of line. I want to ask you to forgive me. And my sons said, well, Dad, we were crazy. I said, well, you are crazy. But you had the right to expect an adult to show up, and a baby did. And I ask you to forgive me for that. Don't let them lose heart. Don't break their spirit, Paul's saying. Next, he's talking to slaves. He goes on to slaves, and this is he's talking about leadership and employers and employees in today's words, in today's terms. He says, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. It's curious, isn't it? Is the Bible supporting slavery? Not any more than it does Roman occupation. And what Paul is saying, it's a call. He's not a call for a justifiable revolution of the status quo. What Paul's saying, wherever you're living, your circumstances you're living, thrive there. And please God in whatever circumstances you're living. See, because the gospel achieves a nobler feat. We can make you free. Okay, you're free. There are no more chains on you. You're free. We can change the Supreme Court. We can change the president. But that doesn't change anything. God's calling for a change inside. See, what Paul's saying, he didn't neglect or in disdain refuse to speak to the slave. The gospel reached down to the lowest levels of society and said, in that level where you're living, you can be noble. It gave slave liberty, which fetters could not hold him. The gospel restores dignity and provides destiny. Viktor Frankl, anybody here ever read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning? Such a great book. He's a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and he's in a Nazi prison camp. And he says, when you're no longer able to change a situation, you're challenged to change yourself. Surrender to the gospel's liberating message changes us. See that even in a Nazi prison camp, you can have dignity and nobility. Suffering is inevitable, but the response is a choice that we can make. And we can make good choices even in a Nazi prison camp. We say in the ministry that my wife and I run, this One Voice, we always say we cannot change the circumstances of our life. We can't. We can choose to react or direct. My whole life I've reacted. That's worked out great. Or I can direct. And Frankl says that meaning can be found in all circumstances, even in being a slave. He identifies 3 sources of meaning: work or creativity. So what you contribute, even as a slave, has a nobility to it. Love in your relationships and suffering, finding redemptive purpose in living out the hardships of your life. You are not a victim of circumstances alone. Even in that horror, Frankl said, you can find dignity. The meaning arises not from what happens to you, but how you react to what happens to you. And Paul's saying with a renewed identity as Christians, even though you're slaves, obey your masters, not with an eye to people please, but in a noble, sincere reverence to God. Even if you're a slave in first century Palestine, there's opportunity for dignity and ministry. And then he says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Before my mom passed away, she gave me this book by Fulton Sheen. Anybody remember Fulton Sheen? Fulton Sheen, Another guy, Bishop Fulton Sheen. He was the Archbishop of New York, and he was on TV in the 60s, in the late 50s and the 60s. And he had these big eyes, man. He was a very evangelical priest. As a matter of fact, he would get in trouble with the Catholic Church. They're saying, well, you're being a little bit too Protestant. My mother gave me this book, Way to Happiness, for Fulton Sheen. And I said, oh, thanks, Mom. Oh, it's great. And I took it up, threw it in a box. I was like, what's this priest going to teach me about how to be a Christian? And what he said in the book, is so much in that book that touched my heart. It's one of my most cherished books. First of all, because my mom gave it to me, but also because it's filled with wisdom. He says, offering up our work to God removes the drudgery and adds nobility to even the most menial tasks. Wow. If I can do that, offer up my work to God, it takes away the drudgery of it, and it adds nobility because it's unto the Lord. I knew this guy, a singer-songwriter, Jimmy Landry. I do a radio show. I've been on the radio for 29 years. And there was this guy, Jimmy Landry, he wrote great songs. I called him up one day, and I said, I just want you to know, your songs affect me. You really do a great job. And he told me the story about growing up. His dad would say, why don't you get a real job? You're not going to be able to provide for a family doing this. Why don't you get a real job? And Jimmy said that always bothered him. His father didn't respect what he did until his father came to see him play in a club in Washington, D.C. He said after the show, his father came back crying. And ma'am, I see why you do this. Your songs touch my heart. I'm sorry I never listened. I'm sorry I never came to hear you play. When we do it, what God has given us to do, when we do that, and we do it in honor of him, there's a nobility in that. And even an old curmudgeon father can realize that. And on the other side of the coin, Paul says, anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. The Christian worker is not to rest on their Christianity. I'm a Christian. Years ago, somebody asked me about making some investment, and I said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. We're Christians. Oh, okay, so a stupid idea is now a good idea, so I should give you money because you're a Christian. Don't rest on your Christianity. In the 70s, I worked in a hospital in Palmdale, California. And one of my friends there, she worked in intensive care. She's a Christian. But the problem was she would read her Bible instead of doing her work. And so other people would have to pick up the slack for her. And she came to me one day. She got in trouble for that. She came to me one day. She said, they're persecuting me. I said, you're not being persecuted, you're being reprimanded because you're disobedient and you're inconsiderate. Everybody else is picking up the slack for you. It's not persecution. So she ended up quitting as a martyr. She'd have been fired anyway. Paul's saying, don't show that partiality. Don't rest on that. Because her manager was a Christian. Actually, her manager, Mrs. Kelly, her husband baptized me. But she was resting on the fact that Mrs. Kelly was a born-again believer, that she could slack off and read her Bible. Partiality means that sometimes bad workers are unfairly rewarded and good workers are penalized and left unrewarded, right? You got a bad guy on the team, you got to make up for him. I run the care team. We have 4 people on staff, and we have 60 volunteers. And we've got great volunteers. And I always say, I have an elite team of volunteers. The care team is an elite team. It's people who give their time and bring great resources. And somebody came to me once, he said, you really shouldn't say elite. It makes other people feel less than. I said, I'm not worried about what average people think. They are elite people, and they should know that they're elite people. David picks out his great warriors. 3 of them, the top guys, and I think it's 30 he's got. And what about the other guys? They're not elite. Paul says you got to be elite. The world gets it, right? God's kingdom should get it too. You should bring your best to God, and there'll be no partiality. You know, we do a lot of stupid things saying we're Christians, right? My old pastor in California said, don't blame your stupidity on the Holy Spirit. The Spirit told me to do it. I'm not sure. And listen, what Paul says, anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there's no favoritism. Listen, that's going to happen. You're going to be repaid for the things you do wrong. There's not going to be no excuses. That's not going to happen. We will be responsible. And lastly, he says, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. A businessman asked his Bible study group one time, how can you tell if you have a servant attitude? How can you tell if you have a servant's attitude? By the way you react when you're treated like one. Wow. I love that. Bingo. Do I feel indignant when I'm treated like a servant? Do I object to it? Do I feel belittled? Do I feel I should be treated better? This echoes the teaching from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus said, in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. And how you forgive, you will be forgiven. My dad, when my dad was dying, I was taking care of him, and that wasn't fun. But I said to him one day, I said, Dad, you have to make, him and his sister had this long-running feud. They didn't talk to each other for decades. They'd be right next to each other in church, and they wouldn't say a word to each other. And I said to him, Dad, you got to make amends with Aunt Helen. It's important. And he said, now this is really my father's voice. People say, is this your father's? No, I don't have to make amends to her. I'm the older brother. I was like, who made that up? Yeah, what is that? So I said, okay, he's not gonna hear me. So I called his sister, my Aunt Helen. And I said, Aunt Helen, your brother's dying. You need to make amends to him. I'm not making amends to him. Let him die alone. I'm the younger sister. Somewhere they had these rules in their minds. So I brought the Bible to my father's house one day, and I said, Dad, do you believe this? Oh, yeah, I believe the Bible, yeah. Well, Jesus says you will be forgiven by the measure that you forgive. If you don't forgive, you won't be forgiven. Now, that's Jesus. That's not me. Now, the odds are you're going to meet him before you meet Aunt Helen, before Aunt Helen meets him. So you better come up with a better excuse. The next morning, I went over to his house to bring him breakfast. He said, I called your aunt last night, and I made amends. Employers are called to treat employees with integrity. Be the boss that I would want. Leaders are to remember that they're also under authority. And anyone in power needs to act humbly and justly, knowing they are accountable to God for how they are acting and how they lead. Radical concepts Paul gives us for first century Christians, but not often followed today, right? How often do we meet with a husband or wife and they say, I'm not happy? Who? You got married to be happy? You're crazy. You should have seen me before you got married. I'd have told you, you ain't going to be happy. But it's an opportunity to be holy. You're not happy. What have you done to serve your husband? What have you done to honor your wife? I don't love her. Okay. You don't feel like you love her. You love her how Christ calls you to love her. Radical concepts for the first century. Radical concepts today because I see it every single week. Don't we? We see it every single week. Families break up because I'm not happy. You're not fulfilling your God-given role. God will bless you if you work in your role. Whether you're a wife, whether you're a husband, whether you're a kid, whether you're an employer or an employee. Here's the key to us for wives and husbands, for children and parents, for slaves and master. In God's kingdom, we possess a new presence. Christ who is our life. We rely on a new power. The Spirit of Christ be continually filled with your spirit. We have a new purpose. Whatever you do in word and deed, do in the name of the Lord Jesus. Takes away the drudgery and it brings nobility to it. And we follow a new pattern. We're not marching to the world's parade. We never have been. We're marching to Christ's orders. Christ is the pattern or model for husbands. Love your wives as Christ loved the church. If we do it unto him, we can do it right. If we try to do it in our own will, in our own feelings, in our own intellect, it will fail. But if we do it in his spirit, we will have loving marriages and we'll have kids that clip the hedges. Maybe. Unless I'm your son. So I want to, God gives Moses a blessing for the people in the Old Testament. And he says that as often as you do this, he says, I want you to have Aaron bless the people. And as often as you bless them, you put my name on them. I remember years ago when I read that, my kids were little, I said, hey, you know what? That's pretty cool. Every single day when my kids leave me, I can pray over them and put God's name on them. As adults, I still do it. When we go over for dinner, Dad, you want to come over for dinner? Sure. Can you bring the pizza? I'm still buying dinner. When we go over and I leave them, I hug them and I kiss them and I pray, Lord, bless you and keep you. And I put God's name on them. And now I get to do it with my grandchildren. It's amazing. I'll just give you one last thing. When I was baptized, the day I was baptized, I came out of the water and the guy said, you know what? You just changed your family tree. I was 22. I was like, I don't have a family tree. I don't know what you're talking about. He said, no. You just introduced eternity into your family. I didn't get that at 22. I didn't really see that vision. I've been able to raise my children a certain way, but my son texted us a couple of years ago and said, could you teach the kids the Bible? I'm teaching the Bible to my grandchildren. Because why? Because it pleases the Lord. So I'd ask you to bow your heads and receive God's blessing this morning. And when you do, I would, for those of you with children, I would admonish you to do this blessing on your children because it says as often as you do it, you put God's name on them. So they go away from you with God's name on them. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and to give you peace. Amen.